Hey, this is Ian again, and this is episode, the hell is this, 8, I think, of my Creating Creative Chaos podcast. And I'm going to be reading chapter 2 of Reluctant Regent, the revised edition today. So I am just going to go ahead and get into it, and we'll get started here. Oh, and I do have to say that one of my more favorite characters will be introduced in this episode today. Okay. So if you remember the previous episode, we um, the main character ended up in a an attorney, which he was required to do. Ended up winning it by some fortuitous chance, helped in no small part by his insane, ugly-looking, crazily smart horse. And basically, he won that and got a lowlander clansman to be kind of indebted to him and stuff like that. So let's just go ahead and start up that right there. Chapter 2, a most dramatic meal. Luckily, or unluckily, depending on how you look at it, my stepfather Virgil would come home later that day and explain loudly and clearly how I had bollocks things up. He had just found me in the library reading de Vartanian's treatise, which had been delivered by a sneering courier on a prancing, non-moose-like horse. How could you? He shouted, wildly waving his spindly arms. What in the endless hells were you thinking? He stopped gesticulating for a moment, stared at me, and then decided that more arm waving accompanied by shouting and pacing was not called for. After all I've done for this decrepit house, all of the sacrifices I've made, it comes to naught in just one day because of the foolishness of a sheltered little boy. He ended his rant on a rather loud, high-pitched shriek, so he was forced to halt for a moment to catch his breath. Yeah, I'm not going to do a loud, high-pitched screech for you guys. Blow out my vocal cords. With a sigh, I closed the treatise and looked at him. He was dressed, as per usual, in a gaudy yellow silk doublet and matching green hose, and looked rather like an overly excited houseplant. I had never really warmed to Rugia, primarily because he had married into our house in an ill-advised attempt to better his fortunes. This was shortly after my biological father died under mysterious circumstances while reading erotic goblin poetry in the king's library. Now, my mother cared for Rugia for some reason, but I never understood what they saw in each other. They never seemed to inhabit the same room at the same time, which I would think would be necessary for a healthy marriage. Or maybe that's the key to spending as much time apart as humanly possible. But then she had the bad grace to die too, and so I couldn't ask, unfortunately. Rugia had an overly inflated opinion of his financial skills and considered himself a political genius who only needed the backing of a great house to become a major player in the kingdom. Now, one would have thought he would have done his research before choosing our house, given our complete and utter lack of political influence or money. But Rugia was never one to let minor details like that derail his grandiose plans. What he had accomplished, and quite handily, I might add, was to deplete our meager fortune in a series of increasingly ill-planned schemes until all the formerly great house Caldor had left was a slowly decaying tower keep, some scattered properties around the kingdom, and a handful of servants who remained only because they didn't have any better to be. Oh, and a well-stocked library, which is where I spent most of my time. Virgia, I said with strained patience, I don't know what you're talking about. All I did was prevent blood feuds with Clan MacDougall and the Frymaids, and then I also acquired an interesting book for our library. Certainly, the king seemed put off by something, but Cyrene looked impressed, and we all know she's the real power in the kingdom, right? What are you whining about? Virgia's face turned an alarming shade of red, and he sputtered for a moment, his mouth soundlessly opening and closing like some sort of strange bullfrog trying to swallow a particularly uncooperative fly. Well, at least it didn't look like a plant anymore, so that was an improvement. Then, abruptly, he calmed down. You fool, he said with wonder. You really don't know. Well, let me explain it to you. By returning a lowlander sword to Minrir, you have not only managed to obligate one of the most skilled warriors in the land, but you've also indebted his entire clan. Everybody knows the McDougalls are the strongest lowlander clan, and they're not entirely happy with our current ruler. They've been looking for allies to get out from under the High King's authority for years, and now you've all but aligned House Caldor with them. And we're the only great house that has taken this step. Just us. You look like you're trying to foment a lowland uprising. He took a deep breath. Then you compounded your error by cozying up to that damn Fry maid. Now everyone knows that the Fry maidens in Aldercore have been unhappy with the tariff rates the king sets on their trade. So they've been looking for allies at court to strengthen their hand in negotiations. And now, apparently, we're aligned with them too. House Caldor, by all appearances, is supporting the two most powerful, troublemaking political groups in the kingdom. But that's not even the worst of it, he continued. You ended this disaster by requesting de Vartanian's treatise, which we all know lays out the idea that the entire concept of nobility is flawed, and that nations should actually be run by people that know what they're doing rather than by somebody who simply managed to be born. Don't you realize that the only reason the king was given the throne is because he was the heir? He's certainly not competent to do anything more complicated than talking about erotic goblin poetry. And as a side, what the hell is it with nobles and their fondness for erotic goblin poetry? The aristocracy is so strange. Anyway, he continued. He's not competent to do anything more complicated than talking about erotic goblin poetry and drinking. You know that. You look like you were calling into question his right to rule. I pursed my lips thoughtfully. I hadn't known that, actually, because the only reason I'd requested the treatise was to read the chapter about the construction of the trade road, not his discussion of the merits of royal succession. As far as I knew, we had a royal family, they slept around, and the progeny that resulted ruled the kingdom. Everyone knew this, and they seemed fine with it, and honestly, I hadn't given it much thought. It was just the way things were and had been for quite some time, and it seemed to work well enough, so I didn't interest me. And last, but certainly not least, Vergia continued, you did all of this after defeating Minrir McDougal on the field of battle, showing everyone that you are a warrior of some skill. Nobody has done that since he was 6. You basically set yourself up to look like one of the battle emperors of old. I stared at him for a moment. Then, with dawning horror, I realized he just might be right. Not that I had intended any of this, of course, but I could certainly see how someone who spent their entire time bootlicking at court would read all sorts of things into otherwise innocuous acts. I'd inadvertently managed to plant myself firmly in the middle of the sort of muddled political tangle that, in my experience, only nobles and other people with far too much time on their hands could create. This is why I don't like people, I muttered as I massaged my now aching temples. I looked distractedly around the library, trying to think of a way out of this catastrophe that wouldn't involve my neck meeting the sharp edge of a headman's axe, or, even worse, more meetings with the court. But the oak shelves, stacked high with dusty books, gave me no insights. Then my eyes lit upon a faded map, almost buried under the book piles on the table in front of me. It listed the few properties that House Caldor still claimed, the largest of which was the far northern province known as Sheepland. It was a tiny, desolate region of rocky hills sparsely covered by tough briar bushes, and home to the fierce, black-fleeced sheep which gave the lands their name. There was only one major town, the oddly named Lamb's Rebuke, and House Caldor was responsible for administering and maintaining a small garrison in the area. The entire province would have been easily forgotten except for the fact that most of House Caldor's income now came from it in the form of exports of black wool and mutton. The tiny library in the Lamb's Rebuke fortress held the largest collection of animal husbandry treatises on sheep rearing and its associated moral issues, as well as the only copy of de Vartanian's histories of the Great Northern Wars, which was an account of the various actions past kings had undertaken against the Sertrani raiders. I'd always wanted to visit, just to peruse de Vartanian's book and, if I'm honest, see exactly what sort of moral issues arose from rearing sheep. But I'd never had the time or energy. As I absently studied the map, I suddenly had an idea, a good one this time. Exile, I shouted excitedly. Virgia, who had been morosely staring out at a nearby window, turned to me in irritation and snapped. What are you on about now? Exile, I said, more calmly this time. You can exile me to, say, Sheepland, and then tell everyone that you did it as a lesson to me for overstepping my bounds. You'll look like a savvy lordling whose loyalty to the crown is beyond reproach. And you'll also get me out of Admini, so I can't botch things up any even more. It's brilliant. He looked at me thoughtfully for a moment, mulling over the advantages of getting me out of his hair with the disadvantages of trusting me out of eyesight. Come on, I wheedled. We need someone up there anyway to keep an eye on the sheepish, to make sure they're not up to anything nefarious. You know their reputation. Well, we do at that, he said. The divines only know what those dim-witted hill folk will get up to without a civilized influence watching over them. And then, he muttered under his breath, so quietly that I barely heard him, I can sell this hovel and finally start living the life I deserve. Yes, yes, Virgia said more loudly, his decision made. I think that would be for the best. So pack your things and get on the road as soon as possible. We don't know how long it will take for the king to decide you're more trouble alive than dead. You're more trouble. You're worth more trouble alive than dead. I don't know what I was trying to go with that. So you need to hurry. Okay, I said, looking at him suspiciously. I didn't care much about Caldor Keep. I did care about the books, and I had no faith that he would keep them around for any longer than it took to sell them. I have one condition. What's that? He snapped, already stalking out of the library. The books. I want the pick of books in the library to take with me. Fine, fine, he said. You can take the wagon and a couple of plow horses. Now it'll slow you down and you'll need to find a drover, but the trade road runs all the way to Lands Rebuke, so you shouldn't have any problems hauling all that crap up there. Great, I said. I'll start packing now then, and I'll be gone in a day or two. Good riddance, he muttered as he stalked to the door. Then he paused. I guess you'll need this. He took off the heavy gold signet ring of House Caldor and threw it on the table. Oh, and take your damn horse with you. He's stinking up the stables and he keeps biting me. With that, he left, and I never saw him again. I will, I shouted after him. Then I began the laborious process of finding crates to hold several of the more interesting books in the library that I wanted to take with me. After that, I spent the rest of the day packing and loading the one rickety wagon that House Caldor could lay claim to, then picking 2 plow horses that looked relatively healthy, and finally coordinating supplies for the trip itself. Once I finished loading the crates of oilskin-wrapped books, I collapsed into my bed and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. I woke early the next morning to a strange rasping sound coming from the stool by my bed. I opened my eyes and beheld a huge, shadowy figure sitting next to me. It was Minrir, calmly running a whetstone along Reasoned Response's razor edge. With a manly shriek, I jumped up and flailed my way out of my blankets, tripping over one of them and falling face first onto the floor. Good morning, he rumbled as I lay there gasping. I finally managed to catch my breath and sat up. What are you doing? Are you here to murder me as part of some sort of bloody lowland feud? Not at all, Minrir said, looking at me with hurt in his eyes. Why would you think that? I wordlessly gestured at Reasoned Response. He looked at his broadsword and nodded thoughtfully. Then he put up his whetstone and then in one smooth motion sheathed the blade in the scabbard on his back. I'm actually here to protect you, he said, getting up and pulling me to my feet. The matriarch of Clan McDougal decided we, or more specifically I, owe you for returning Reasoned Response after the melee yesterday. Your gesture of support was something we all appreciated, and the fact that you did it in front of the king was most impressive, if honestly foolhardy. When we heard that you had been banished to Sheepland, the matriarch asked me to accompany you to keep you safe from assassins, bandits, and stuff. He gestured to a full leather pack at his feet with the heavy pieces of his plate armor strapped to it. But I didn't intend... I stopped for a moment. Wait a minute. How did you know I'd been banished to the north? It wasn't hard, he replied. Virgie has been out all night, drinking and telling everyone who will listen that he exiled you for your insult to the king. He's been very proud and loud about it. Well, I suppose that's to be expected, I muttered. Oh, well, thank you then. I should finish packing and see about getting a drover for the wagon. I think getting out of Admini sooner rather than later would be a good idea. Minrir grunted in assent and then stood, grabbing his pack, and then he walked to the door. I'll go see to the horses, he said as he left. But don't worry about hiring anyone to drive the wagon. I can do that well enough myself. Okay, I'll be down in a bit, I replied. Then I set about getting dressed. A few minutes later, I came down to the keep's courtyard and found to my astonishment that the wagon was already fully loaded with two placid draft horses hitched up and Minrir sitting in the drover's seat. This goes to show never underestimate how quickly and efficiently someone with ability and a will to work can get things done if you just leave them to it. He was wearing a leather jerkin studded with small iron plates and had a simple iron cap on his head. Reasoned response was sheathed behind him where he could easily bring it to hand, and a wickedly spiked steel throwing axe hung on his wide leather belt. The wagon behind him was loaded with wooden boxes of dried beef and fruit and a barrel of weakly watered wine, while several water skins hung on the sides of the wagon bed. Those, along with the general traveling supplies I had gathered yesterday, which consisted of a few oiled leather tarps, a bedroll, a tinder box, basically things I remembered reading that one would need on the road. Anyway, those rounded out the load, along with Minrir's travel pack and my crates of books, which were safely tucked under the seat. I was wearing my brown gambeson and had found an ancient black oak crossbow hidden in a cobwebbed corner of House Caldor's sadly diminished armory. I took it and two quivers of wickedly spiked bolts to give myself the illusion of being armed. A set of sturdy leather boots, an oiled greatcloak, and a small leather satchel stuffed with writing supplies and a pair of gray woolen pants completed my attire, along with a broad-bladed utility knife that I had been given as a child. As I placed my crossbow and satchel in the wagon, I looked around for the last member of our expedition. Where's Moose? I asked. A scream from the stables answered my question, and I saw the aged stable hand stumbling out of the barn, swearing incoherently and holding his bloody ear. The damned demon ate my ear, he shouted. What sort of critter would be so evil as to do that? That sort, I said, gesturing to Moose as he trotted into the courtyard. He seemed in high spirits as he pranced towards me, his wiry tail swishing back and forth, and his malformed ears perked forward. He had an unsettling gleam in his eyes, and I could see a spot of blood on his lips. Get him out of here, the stableman shrieked as he tottered towards the keep. He's nothing but trouble, bloody damn demon horse. He vanished inside, the heavy wooden door slamming behind him. I looked at Moose disapprovingly. Did you really need to do that? I asked. Even if he was rude, which I don't doubt he was, removing a person's ear seems a bit much. Moose snorted in contempt and stood still as I mounted. Okay, well, just don't make a habit of this, I said as we started out of the courtyard. You can't just eat everyone that annoys you, much as you'd like to, and as much as they honestly probably deserve it. It's rude. It's just simply not done in polite society. Yeah, and you're supposed to be an herbivore for divine's sake. So why don't you start acting like one? Moose ignored me and trotted through the gate. Then Minrir clucked the reins and the two docile draft horses followed. We were off. When we crested the rise that would lead us to the trade road, I looked back at the only home I'd ever known. The ivy-covered stone walls, the central tower with a thin stream of smoke coming from the kitchen chimney, the overgrown apple orchards spreading through the narrow valley, and the early morning haze rising from the fertile ground. It gave the entire scene the appearance of a dream, albeit one with a few nightmarish elements included, which mainly was the brimstone and burnt hay smell emanating from my steed. As I said, I never saw it or Virgie again, so this moment is something that I remember with some fondness to this day. Actually, I just lied. I never missed Regia and his endless scheming, and quite frankly, putting as many leagues as possible between the two of us was probably the best for everyone involved. Caldor Keep was a drafty, smelly mess even on the best of days, and the haze rising from the ground came from the moist manure our cows deposited liberally everywhere they could find the space to do so. After I left, Ergius stole the entire thing to a pig farmer who tore everything down and turned the entire valley into one gigantic pigsty, which it remains to this day. Urgi himself died a few months later when his misguided attempts to seduce a local noble's daughter backfired horribly, and her mother sent a professional duelist after him. Anyway, I left and I haven't looked back since. My future, for better or worse, now lay in the north, amongst the good folk, I sincerely hoped, of Sheepland. The first week of the trip northward passed pleasantly. The weather was mild, and Moose was in a relatively good behavior, other than trampling the occasional squirrel that ill-advisedly thought to visit our campsite. Travel on the trade road was steady, with a stream of farmers' carts laden with produce, mainly cabbages, from what I could tell, heading south, and merchant wagons laden with various goods, which were mainly whatever people traded cabbages for, heading north. Minrir turned out to be a good, if taciturn, travel companion, as well as a surprisingly competent cook. We camped either under the stars or in one of the clean and bustling tavern houses beside the road. Minrir set a slow but steady pace so as not to overly tire the draft horses, and Moose was content to spend his energies chasing rodents or giving everyone we passed on the road an evil leer. The Lowlander spent some time every evening chaining me on how to use my crossbow, so I became a passable shot with it, and even managed to bring down a deer for dinner one afternoon. All in all, it was a quiet and relaxing trip through the settled central lands of the kingdom, and one I still remember with some fondness. And this time I'm actually not kidding. But this peacefulness came to an abrupt and messy end at an otherwise innocuous tavern called Lorgan's Wheelhaven. We arrived at the stoutly built wooden tavern after a hard, dusty day of traveling. The first thing I noticed was several rough-looking horses tethered to the hitching rail out front, but I thought nothing of it as I dismounted and stretched. Minrir unhitched our draft horses, leading them to the water trough beside the thatched barn, while Moose gave the other horses a flat glare. They suddenly began showing a studious interest in examining the ground underneath their noses, pointedly not making eye contact with my mangy steed, until, with a disappointed snort, Moose ambled over to the trough and began noisily slaking his thirst. "I'll go find the stable hand," Minrir said as he strapped on his broadsword. "Why don't you go in and see what they're offering for supper?" I nodded. Then I went over and pushed open the tavern door and walked inside. Lorgan's had a large common room with several sturdily built tables and chairs scattered about, and a long bar stretched along the back. There was a door behind the bar that probably led to a kitchen or some sort of storeroom, but otherwise the room was empty except for a group of weathered and scarred warriors who sat around a table in the middle of the room, talking quietly amongst themselves and noisily slurping down bowls of stew. They were clad in a motley assortment of leather and mail, with knives, swords, and various other implements of mayhem hanging off of their belts. In short, they seemed like the types of people who should best be avoided. A sudden silence fell as I walked in, sat down at a table. They all looked at me, then glanced at each other. Well, this seems ominous, I thought as I looked around the room. Wonder who these people are and where the tavern keeper is. Just then, the largest and most scarred of the group put down his spoon and shoved his chair back from the table. He stood up and came over to me. "Are you Mathias of House Caldor?" he grunted, looking at me speculatively while idly toying with the wickedly serrated blade lying next to him on the table. Yes," I said hesitantly. "Do I know you, fine gentlefolk?" "Well, this was easy," he said to his companions. They grinned amongst themselves, revealing a rather disconcerting collective lack of teeth. I looked on with gathering alarm as they all stood and began pulling out knives, clubs, and other assorted weaponry. Is there something I should know about? What are you lot up to? Simple, lad. We're collecting a rich bounty, cackled the wizened woman as she twirled a three-bladed dirk in her hands. The knife, while impressive, seemed as much a danger to the stabber as the stabbee, in my inexpert opinion, and judging from the scars on her arms, that was an accurate assessment on my part. I reflected that if she was comfortable wielding something as obviously impractical as a three-bladed dirk, both she and the rest of her motley band showed a frightening lack of foresight and self-preservation instincts. But just as I was about ready to turn and flee, strategically retreat, a cheerful voice cut through the tension in the room. "Hello there, traveler," a young woman said as she bustled out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her spotless white apron. "I'm Kells, and I'm so sorry I didn't hear you come in. Sit, come on, eat. You poor dear, you look like you've had such a hard day." She slid gracefully between the thugs and ushered me to a table. "Now let me get you some nice cold ale and a bowl of cabbage soup." She had long, cold, dark, straight hair and a dancer's slender build, with warm brown eyes that radiated joy and compassion. In short, she was a sorely needed ray of sunshine amongst the unwashed and largely toothless folk around me. She glanced at the gang of miscreants milling about confusedly in the middle of the room, their planned stabbery derailed by the unexpected arrival of her civilizing influence. "What's wrong?" she said. "Was the stew not good?" She seemed so emotionally devastated at the prospect that the thugs looked at their feet and began shuffling awkwardly, muttering, "No, no, it was quite good, young miss," and "'twas the best stew I've ever had," and "yeah, it was much better than me mum's food, that's for sure," and other things along those lines. They slowly went back to their table and sat down. "Oh, that's such a relief," Kel said, beaming. "I made it just for you, and I would be so upset if you didn't like it." "Well, I'll have some of that excellent stew too, please," I said, not wanting to disappoint her. It really did smell delicious. "Oh, no, silly," she said as she looked down at me with a fond smile and patted my head. "That's not for you. Let me get you some nice cabbage soup and ale, okay?" She bustled back to the kitchen, humming cheerfully to herself. "Yes, miss," I called after her and sat back in my chair, worriedly looking at the gang of would-be assassins as they dutifully finished their meal. They occasionally glanced at me, wordlessly promising that my near future would be a violent and unpleasant one just as soon as they could manage it without disappointing our hostess. I kept a wary eye on them as they ate, and then I soon noticed that they are all starting to get an odd greenish tinge to their faces. Oh, and their eyes were slowly closing. "I'm so tired, boss," the three-bladed hag yawned. "Can we stab the young lordling now and get some rest?" "We probably shouldn't," he said as he struggled to keep his eyes open. "It's, rude, and Kells would have to clean up the mess. We don't want to upset." With a thud, his head hit the table and he began snoring. The rest of his gang soon followed, but the snoring didn't last long, however, as one by one the thugs sighed contentedly and stopped breathing. Just as the last thug quieted, Minrir opened the door and walked in. "Sorry it took so long," he said as he sat down at the table. "I couldn't find a stable hand, so I had to put up the horses myself." He glanced up at the table of motionless thugs and quirked an eyebrow at me. "I swear I didn't do that," I said. "All I know is they shouted something about a bounty, then they ate stew, and then they fell asleep. I think they actually meant to kill me. Oh, also, they now appear to be dead." "Huh," he grunted. "Well, at least that's over with. I'd hate to dirty up this nice, clean common room with a reasoned response. Do you know if they have ale? I'm a bit parched." "Here you are," chirped Kells as she came out of the kitchen. "Oh, and now you have a friend. How nice. I have some nice warm soup and a tankard of ale for you too, don't worry. I even put some lemon in it. You don't want to get scurvy, do you?" She placed a steaming bowl of soup in front of me, along with a mug of ale so cold that the condensation was running down the sides. Would you like some too, sir? She asked Minrir. Aye, that sounds nice. Thank you, he said, looking up at her with a furrowed brow. Kells bustled off back to the kitchen, humming a catchy tune. As soon as she left the room, I leaned over to Minrir and whispered, Minrir, shh, I don't think it's a good idea to eat or drink anything here. Oh, why not? He asked. I wordlessly pointed over at the clearly deceased thugs, just as Kells cheerfully fluttered back into the room. I froze, and, after a brief moment of hesitation and quick thinking, jammed my finger knuckle deep up my nose. Just gotta clear out those sinuses a bit, Minrir, I said loudly as I dug around industriously. You know it's the best way to appreciate fine cabbage soup like this. I grinned at Kells, trying desperately to come across as a feckless fool, which, I must say, I pulled off swimmingly. Don't be silly, Mathias, she said as she put down Minrir's food. You don't have to worry about ending up like them. She gestured towards the table of silent thugs. They were being naughty and were very, very mean to the innkeeper and his wife. They weren't even going to bury them until I asked nicely. Can you imagine? So rude. She pouted for a moment, then brightened. But they won't be rude anymore, will they? Nope, I suppose not, Minrir said and began loudly slurping up his soup. Slowly removed my finger from my nose, looking between the stoic warrior industriously shoveling cabbage soup into his maw and the pretty barmaid / mass murderer who was beaming at us like a proud mother. I'm sorry, I finally said, but are you both insane? You, I pointed a shaking finger at Kells, just poisoned a bunch of people, and you, I pointed another shaking finger at Minrir, are eating like we're on some sort of picnic, but a picnic with a bunch of dead people. What's wrong with you two? Calm down, Minrir grunted around a mouthful of soup. She's clearly a shroud and was probably sent to protect you just like I was. Relax. Eat your soup. A shroud, I gasped. Now I had read about these semi-mythical assassins, mostly in lurid true, as opposed to false, crime novels, where they managed to murder various nobles and then abscond before the law could catch them. But I'd never actually thought they existed, much less that one would appear as a cheerful barmaid. Is it true? I asked. Are you a shroud sent to protect me? I could tell you, but then I'd have to kill you, Kells said cheerfully, which would, sort of defeat the point of the whole exercise. Oh, I was speaking hypothetically, I said quickly. In fact, forget it. The whole thing was a joke, a really, really bad joke, a shroud. How silly. In fact, I don't even know what we're talking about right now. Heck, you're funny, Kel said. I like you. And yes, I was hired to protect you from meanies like this. She gestured at the table of deceased would-be bounty hunters. Well, who would hire a shroud to protect me, I wondered. I'm hardly important enough for that, am I? Well, someone thought so, she said. Now finish up your soup. It's getting cold and your ale is getting warm. We need to leave before anyone else shows up and starts asking awkward questions. As an aside, I found out later that Cyrene had actually hired her. We'd only met briefly, and yet she was already looking out for me. That's just the kind of forward-thinking woman she was and is. I numbly began eating the cooling, but still quite tasty soup, while Kells bustled around the room, tidying up the furniture and wiping down the tables. After he finished, Minrir went out to rehitch the wagon, while I helped Kells collect and wash the dishes. Then I carefully dried them and put them in the wooden racks behind the counter. I dare say we left the place cleaner than we found it, except for, all the corpses. Soon the three of us were traveling down the trade road in the gathering dust. Kells walking alongside the wagon and whistling a cheery tune, while Minrir sat stolidly in the drover's seat. Lorgan's Wheelhaven faded into the darkness behind us as we continued our journey north. And that's how I met Kells, a close friend who could be relied on to effortlessly lighten her dark room with her cheerful good humor, and then just as effortlessly murder everyone in it. So that's chapter 2. Um, I think Kells is probably one of my favorite characters, and I know I mentioned this in my previous uh, for chapter 1. But when I have these characters, basically I base them not so much on a person as an idea that a person prompts in me. And this is definitely coming from one of the nicest coworkers I've ever had, and she quite frankly terrified me in a lot of ways because she was so nice. I'm like, come on, man, we gotta have at least some disagreements here. But like I said, totally nice person. And I just started thinking about just, if I needed to make an assassin, she would be the perfect one for it. So that was kind of the impetus for that. God, I hope she's not actually killing people. I doubt it. But anyway, I thought when I thought about getting her into this book, it was actually probably one of the better ideas I've had. And as far as the rest of it, we're just moving the plot along. Again, I just tried to think about logically why he would end up somewhere like Sheepland, and it just kind of the logic train just kind of wrote itself in a lot of ways. Yeah. So that's that. Chapter 3 will actually which I'll do next week. We'll actually get up to Sheepland, and we'll start with the wars and the bloody parts of the story. So I hope you guys have a good week, and I will see you next week.